Rick Grimes is the face of The Walking Dead. He is the sheriff who wakes up from a coma, finds a ruined world, and becomes a leader of a ragtag group trying to survive. He's courageous, determined, and, depending on where you stop watching, either a tragic hero or a despot in training. But there is one question I want to put onto the table, and I ask myself anytime I either watch the TV show or read any of the comics, and that is whether Rick was ever truly a hero of The Walking Dead or just more so an unfortunate victim of it. And spoiler warning, this video will cover key events throughout the comics and TV series, so if you somehow miraculously haven't watched it all, you might want to turn your eyes away and just go to another video on my channel or whatever. Because, as I said, this is going to be including major character arcs, brutal turning points, and if you don't want the ending spoiled, maybe come back after you finish the apocalypse. But with that out of the way, let's start talking. So, in the show and in the comics, it always frames Rick as the protagonist until either we get into the comics and he gets gone off and we start following Carl. He is our moral center of the collapse of the world that we kind of get to see sort of through his eyes and the rest of the group that we follow around. He's introduced as this brave, self-sacrificing, principled character, and in the early seasons of the show, we see him as the hope that is still left in humankind. He risks his life to save strangers, he negotiates, he defends, and when push comes to shove, he makes the hard choices. But The Walking Dead is also a story about cost, and it slowly forces us to ask, what is the moral price of survival? And Rick does have to face that fact, because with all of his nobility, a price will have to come to pay in a way that makes the kind of leader that we should admire in either him as a character or the way that we want to find a leader to admire. By the end of his arc, the answer really does get messy, and let's just unpack why it gets so messy in terms of how he is as a character in terms of being a good guy or a bad guy. And the main thing that we have to talk about that is the fact of heroism versus power, because everybody knows that power is a very slippery slope. Because in The Walking Dead, the first lesson that they teach us is very simple. Power changes people. Rick's early decisions, forming a group, settling rules, and choosing who lives are all survival leadership. But those choices accumulate, small compromises become habits, and protecting your people becomes protecting your authority. It starts off small. Who gets a place at camp? Who enforces discipline? Rick's choices feel necessary at first, but patterns eventually start to emerge. He rarely consults, he tolerates violence among insiders, and he increasingly decides for others without ever asking for consent. Leadership becomes command. Command becomes coercion, and that's not a hero's journey, it's just the making of a warlord. Rick often argues that the ends justify the means. Do you risk the group to save a stranger? Is the life of one worth the safety of many? There are many questions like that define his morality. He repeatedly chooses what he thinks is pragmatic, what he thinks is the best option in his own opinion. But pragmatism in wartime can conceal darker impulses. Like pride, like the thrill of control, like the need to be right, or whatever. Consider the governor fights. In Woodbury and in the prison arc, Rick's tactics escalate to siege mentality. The result isn't merely survival, it's revenge, posture, and a slow erosion of empathy. He justifies murder and torture as necessities. But are they really? Or are they just tools of someone more interested in victory than justice? We see the spiraling of his character and the kind of character that he eventually becomes. And we even see just the kind of character that he could have become in terms of Shane and his entire journey of coming from beginning to his inevitable death during the earlier seasons and earlier parts of the storyline. Because Rick and Shane's arc in the show are very much a moral crucible, because Shane is that raw, animalistic survival type that is very effective and very brutal. He is quite literally the kind of person that was perfectly built to survive in an apocalyptic world, but Rick in the earlier season had that idealistic, legalistic, and occasionally naive kind of view that wouldn't let them to cooperate with each other, at least in this point in time. If Rick had been like he is, at least like in the later season 4, season 5 kinds of Rick and on, when he first got into the apocalypse, him and Shane would have been a dangerous duo. Because Shane's actions, attempted murder, usurpation, and monstrous, and a lot of other things that he has done would have been very much more in the Rick style that we have later on. But he also recognizes the harsh world sooner than Rick does. That's what I mean to say. He is the kind of character that was perfectly so well suited to being a zombie apocalypse survivor with just basic kind of who he is, that it makes a lot more sense to see how Rick turns into who he is. When Shane kills Otis and later confronts Rick, the show forces us to choose the cold, decisive pragmatist or the leader who clings on to that pre-collapse values that we eventually have to see learn the hard way the kind of world he is now living in. Shane's death was framed as righteous. Rick kills his friend to protect the group, seemingly a heroic act. But what does it cost Rick? It teaches him that he can kill in order to protect order. Basically, that's all it is. It normalizes execution when leadership is threatened. That moment that is arguably the seed of Rick's later descent. He learns that lethal force preserves authority. And then we have everything that starts happening later on. The cost of community building, whether it's Alexandria or specifically the decline of democracy. In terms of the fact that Alexandria is supposed to be this utopian experiment, structured governance, safety, and the hope that civilization is rebuilding itself. Rick also becomes the de facto head of the community because he can do what they cannot. He can defend. But instead of fostering civic participation, he centralizes power. He disciplines people, centers like disinterest or whatever, and he looks at decision making with Diana and the council and ultimately acts as a judge, jury, and executioner. The town's democratic veneer collapses under martial logic, and Rick stops being a citizen and starts becoming a state. The basic head of authority in anywhere that he kind of goes from now on. That might be effective for survival, but it's not what democracy looks like, and especially when you find somewhere that actually can be safe. Obviously, having the edge like you already should have would make a lot of sense, but at least being able to still understand that it doesn't always have to be like that, we need to kind of have a good, decent bit of both. And then when we get to the entirety of the war with the saviors and how it crystallizes Rick's evolution, because this is not self-defense, it's just total war. Rick's strategy moves from containment to annihilation. He sets traps, kidnaps wives and children, incites arson, and celebrates mass casualties. Carol and the others commit atrocities for the cause, and the lines between justice and vengeance very, very well blur. Even when Rick negotiates, it's to obtain dominance. Look at the night before Negan's defeat. The plan wasn't just to end the threat, it was to humiliate. The punishment fits the crime, sure, but the manner shifts Rick away from the protector that we would hope he was towards a conqueror. Because Rick's justification for violence, that necessary evil, becomes a very morally slippery slope. Take his "we have to be a kingdom" speech that it's not really about safety. It's about performance and about power. He constructs an ideological justification for ruling by force, and this is the moment that heroism becomes imperialism. And the audience's empathy towards Rick is what really makes him dangerous, because we rationalize his actions because we're told to root for him. We forget that similar rhetoric has justified real world atrocities and real world problems, and The Walking Dead is this very powerful source because it makes everything an uncomfortable parallel. We look like protection on TV, on like the way that we don't have to deal with it in real life, can be oppression in very every other way, just because of the fact that it's not happening to us. We can still actively look at it and still see that it is causing damage in that world. It might not be ours, but it is still a world that could very well be a better place in another universe, just with these characters going different paths in different ways. And let's also not ignore the trauma, because Rick's turning point isn't purely off of moral calluses or whatever. It is psychological. The accumulation of death, loss, betrayal, and everything else alters his cognition. PTSD, survivor's guilt, and grief really well would harden anybody. He uses cruelty to avoid feeling helpless again. Killing becomes a safety mechanism. Empathy causes you to, risk, so he numbs that entire part out. This is more tragic than it is villainous because Rick is both the perpetrator and the victim. The show uses him to explore how trauma dehumanizes, and even those who start with the best intentions can still go down these dark, horrific paths. And then, eventually, Rick starts making errors that aren't just tragic, they're catastrophic. His tactical mistake and overreaches eventually cause innocents to die. Examples like when he leads reckless raids or lets vendettas overrule negotiations, when he trusts people in the wrong times, and each mistake basically compounds that moral debt of his leadership because, yes, his relationship with Judith and the kids is a very big human counterbalance, proof that he still loves and still wants to do good, but that love and absolute responsibility doesn't absolve the ripple of effects that he's caused with violence and everything else like that, and the lives that he's eventually caused to be lost in his search for that power that he's kind of been holding on to. And even when he does die, technically in the show, in the way that they make him out to, once we eventually see him back in his own show with the ones who live, we see the kind of character that he's become. He's still doing all of these things, and we see the lives that he takes in order to achieve his own freedom and just sacrificing everybody else. And I know that a lot of people might be wondering, like, if Rick isn't the hero, or if Rick doesn't really embody heroism, who does? Because, yes, Rick is that poster child. But if we were to look at elsewhere, characters like Glenn, Maggie, Aaron, or whatever embody that quiet hero kind of aesthetic. They build, they sacrifice, and they negotiate. And they retain that moral humility that Rick eventually starts to kind of lose later on. Carol's arc is a lot more complicated because she commits atrocities but also does protect, and her character development from the character that we see in the beginning of the show or comics to the point that she is now is a lot more interesting and a lot more kind of empathetic towards the kind of character that she actually is. And along with the fact of her just being one of my favorite characters in the entire universe in general, along with the fact that Michonne offers that integrity and measured judgment that is very just good to see. And then with Glenn, before his death specifically, it just shows you that moral courage, risking himself for others without craving power, and a character that really did embody heroism because he never let the apocalypse kind of almost completely consume him. Yes, he had those dark and more brutal instincts that Rick has basically given to him, and he was able to get himself and make sure to take care of himself. But he didn't kill for any real big sake because I don't think, if I remember correctly, I don't think he ever actually killed anybody. But he still had that innocence about him, that heroism about him, while still understanding that things needed to get done in a very specific way. He had that kind of best of both worlds aesthetic between him. If Rick is the face, they are the entire backbone that still kind of give him the ability to be perceived as a good person. Because, yes, we can say that Rick is a good person, but Negan said it himself. If he had faced Rick during season 4 or whatever, bearded fool Rick, that is not somebody that he knows he could have beat without any kind of problem whatsoever. That was a entire different kind of monster. And we also need to be honest with ourselves about those storytelling mechanics that they really kind of push through us. Because, yes, Rick is a different kind of monster. But we also need to be honest about how the show centers Rick. His perspective shapes that sympathy that we have for him. When we see the world through his eyes, his decisions look reasonable. He's protagonist, so the narrative treats his actions as a necessity. This isn't accidental, obviously. It's storytelling at its finest, and it's a choice to create tension between the viewer and morality between the character's behavior and everything else like that. The framing is a part of the critique. We are a little complicit because we literally watch this anyways. We cheer for the man who lets us imagine us as the savior, even as he becomes something else. The show isn't failing us. It's teaching us that we watch things and we watch the myth on how it's formed and not the way that we should be needing to see it. So, yeah. The final verdict on my end is Rick Grimes was never the true hero of The Walking Dead. He was a protector, yes, but a hero is not a word that I might want to give him, because not in the mythic, untouched sense. He was that leader. He was that protector. He was the man who did heroic things, but also was a product of his world. Traumatized, increasingly authoritarian, and morally compromised by such a large margin. His character arc is tragic because he starts as a symbol of hope and ends as a cautionary tale. In a world without institutions, leaderships, cures towards force, Rick is both proof that yes, somebody must lead, and a warning that power corrupts even the most well-intentioned. Because the biggest saying that I will always hear and I will always have to say is that absolute power will absolutely corrupt no matter what you do. But yeah. If you guys did enjoy this video, make sure leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment down below on who do you think was the real moral center of the Walking Dead universe. And make sure, hit that notification bell so you guys can get more updates on whenever I do post videos. But with all that said, I hope you guys did enjoy, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.